cargo shuttle smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and Mara Voss thought that was probably the most human thing left in the universe. She pressed her thumb against the porthole and watched the refueling station shrink behind them, a gray wheel of metal and bad decisions orbiting a gas giant that had no name yet. Only a catalog number the Conclave had given it when they claimed the system 4 months ago. The Conclave. She mouthed the word quietly, the way you'd mouth a word in a language you were still learning, but had started to dream in. The Conclave didn't call themselves invaders. They called themselves architects. They had arrived with no weapons and no aggression, just 11 enormous vessels that settled into orbit around Earth on a Tuesday morning in March, and a broadcast in every human language simultaneously, and a single statement that they repeated for 72 hours without variation. We have come to assess your readiness. Mara had been in a faculty cafeteria in Stuttgart when the broadcast started, eating a bowl of lentil soup that had gone cold. She was 41 years old, a former materials engineer who had spent the last decade lecturing graduate students about polymer fatigue, while quietly drinking herself into a comfortable numbness. She was, by any metric she could name, a failing human being. She had a daughter she barely called. She had a body that ached in the mornings. She had a mind that was still sharp in the way a knife is sharp when it's been left in a drawer. Functional, but narrower than it used to be. She remembered looking up from her soup at the cafeteria screen and feeling, of all things, curiosity that had surprised her. Now she was 18 months on the far side of that Tuesday morning, sitting in a shuttle that smelled like stale oxygen and heading toward a conclave waste station where she and 11 others had been invited to participate in what the conclave's liaison had called, with what might have been bureaucratic neutrality or something else entirely, a final evaluation. She didn't know what that meant. Nobody did. The conclave didn't explain its terms. The man in the seat beside her was named Daniel Park, and he was eating a protein bar with the focused attention of someone who had not eaten in a while. He was Korean-American, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now just honest. She saw from the briefing files that he'd been a restaurant owner in Busan, that he had gone bankrupt twice, that he had 3 children and an ex-wife who had not spoken to him in 2 years. He had been selected for the evaluation the same way she had, without explanation, without warning. A conclave notification appearing one morning on a standard comm device between a weather update and a message, a streaming service about an expiring subscription. He caught her looking and offered half his protein bar. She accepted it. "Do you know what it is they want us to do?" he asked. His English was careful, not labored. "No," she said. "The brief says assessment of human adaptive capacity. That tells me nothing." "Me either," he chewed. Outside the porthole, the gas giant turned with majestic indifference. "I had a restaurant," he said, "twice, both failed. I used to think that meant I was a failure." Paused. "Now I think it just meant the timing was wrong, or the market," she offered. "Or me," he said without self-pity, "just precisely. I think I was too attached to the version of the restaurant that existed in my head. Real one kept trying to be something different, and I wouldn't let it." Mara thought about that for a moment. "I did the same thing with my career," she said, "and my marriage." "Did you?" "I was a very good engineer. I could see failure coming in materials before anyone else. Microfractures, stress points. I was very accurate about failure." She turned the half-protein bar over in her fingers. "Just not about where the real stress points were." He nodded slowly. "So they put both of us on this shuttle." Apparently, the conclave way station was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something architectural, deliberate, the way human structures announce themselves as structures. Instead, it was organic, a vast formation of interlocked chambers that resembled distance, a coral reef, or a termite colony, or the inside of a human lung under a microscope. It was dark in places and luminous in others, with a cold blue-white light that seemed to emanate from the material itself rather than any fixture. As the shuttle docked and they were guided through an airlock by a conclave attendant, one of the small, dense-bodied beings that served as the conclave's interface with humanity, not the true conclave decision-makers, who had never appeared directly at all. Mara felt the size of the place settle on her like a weather system. The attendant was called, in the transliteration humans used, something like Osek. It had 4 limbs, 2 of which it walked on, 2 of which it held in a posture that resembled folded patience. Its face was broad and flat, its eyes set far apart and a deep amber color, and it communicated partly in modulated vocalization, and partly in a subsonic vibration, that humans felt in the sternum rather than heard with the... Mara had been told to expect this. She hadn't been told how strange it would feel to realize she was reading meaning from a vibration in her chest. Osik led them to a chamber where the other 10 humans were already assembled. She scanned the group quickly with the habit of someone who had once assessed materials. A teenager, maybe 17, sat with her knees pulled up and her eyes moving. An elderly man with thick white hair and a cane carved from what looked like olive wood. A woman in her 30s who wore the worn jacket of a Ukrainian army maintenance corps. A man who might have been 40 or might have been 60, dense quiet of someone who had spent a long time working with his hands. Others. 12 humans total, from 8 countries. No common language except as a lingua franca, of varying proficiency. No obvious professional connection. No clear pattern. Osek vibrated something that the translation device on Mara's wrist rendered as, "You have been identified." The elderly man with the olive wood cane, she would learn his name was Reuven, that he was 83 years old, that he had been a kibbutz engineer in the Negev for 50 years, and had recently been told he had perhaps 8 months to live. Said, in heavily accented English, identified as what? Osek's amber eyes moved to him. The translation device said, "Theer, carriers." Evaluation session lasted 9 hours. It was not a test in any format Mara recognized. There were no questions, instruments applied to them, no cognitive exercises. Instead, Osek and 2 other attendants simply presented them with problems. Physical problems, material problems, social problems, problems of logistics and resource allocation, and watched. The problems were not solvable. She understood that within the first hour, the chamber's oxygen feed was partially blocked, and the temperature was dropping. 3 of the 12 humans had useful technical skills for this problem. 3 others had no relevant skills but had something else. A capacity for reading the room, identifying which of the technically skilled people needed support or direction. For keeping the group's anxiety below the threshold of paralysis. The rest were somewhere in between. Mara found herself doing what she had always done, looking for the fracture point. Not in the materials. There were no materials, but in the group itself. She could see it forming between the Ukrainian maintenance officer and the man who worked with his hands. Turned out to be a Congolese pipefitter named Emmanuel. They were both competent and they both knew it, and they were circling each other with the careful aggression of people who had learned to compete for limited resources their whole lives. She stepped between them, not with authority she didn't have, but with a piece of information she did. The block is in the secondary feed, not the primary. Emmanuel, you can reach the secondary from the floor panel. Sergeant, if you take the primary bypass. They both looked at her. Together it's a 20-minute fix, she said. Alone it's an hour. We don't have an hour at this temperature. They looked at each other. 23 minutes later, the oxygen feed was restored. Osek vibrated something that didn't translate, but the amber eyes moved across the room with an expression she couldn't read, and she had the distinct impression of being observed not as a specimen but as a revelation. The evaluations continued. On the 3rd day, problem was a navigational crisis. Their shuttle, a different one, a conclave vessel they'd been given partial access to, had sustained damage to its guidance array, and they needed to plot a transit through a debris field, using instruments calibrated for conclave sensory ranges, not human ones. The instruments showed data in a light spectrum humans could only partially perceive, processed it through a computational logic that assumed the user could hold 17 simultaneous variables in active working memory. A human, it turned out, could not hold 17 simultaneous variables in active working memory, but 12 humans, each holding 2 or 3, talking to each other in a mix of languages with Reuven, translating between Emmanuel's Lingala and the teenager's Japanese and the Ukrainians. Instructions and Mara's engineering calculations. 12 humans, networked, improvising a shared cognitive architecture on the fly, could hold all 17. It took them 6 hours. It should have taken 20 minutes with the proper operator. They did it anyway. Osik said, through the translator. Why do you share the load this way? Daniel looked up from the navigational board and said, simply, because none of us is enough alone. This is normal for us. Osik was still for a long moment. This is not normal, it said, finally. Most species develop tools to extend individual capacity. You extend each other. Nobody had a response to that. But the elderly man, Ryuvan, leaned on his olive wood cane and said, we've been doing it since before we had words, probably before we had fire. On the 5th day, Osik took Mara aside. The room it led her to was small and very still, and the walls emitted a soft warmth that reminded her irrationally of the library in the university town where she'd grown up. The way old buildings hold their heat. She sat on what functioned as a chair. Osik settled across from her, in a posture she had come to recognize as its equivalent of careful attention. You want to ask me something, she said. We have been assessing humans for 40 years. Osik said, through the translator. Before you were aware of us. I know. In that time we have evaluated 11,047 individual humans, drawn from every inhabited region of your planet, selected for the specific quality we were measuring. And what quality is that? Osik was quiet for a moment. The subsonic vibration she felt in her sternum was not a word the translator caught. It was below language, something that registered in her as a physical sensation, a pressure that wasn't exactly pressure, that resembled what she could only describe as the feeling of a door being considered. Your species carries something, Osik said at last. Inside the body. Not in the brain. Not in any organ we can identify. A potential that exists in a dormant state in nearly every human we have examined. In most of your species it remains dormant for an entire lifetime. In some it awakens partially, in moments of extreme stress or profound stillness. In a very few, it paused. In a very few it is close to the surface. Mara thought about the polymer fatigue lectures. About the way a material under stress will sometimes reveal a property it hadn't shown before. Not flaw, not a fracture, but a characteristic that the manufacturing process had locked away, accessible only under the right conditions of heat and pressure. And you think we're the few, she said. We have known for some years, Osik said carefully, that humanity is approaching a threshold. A point of civilizational stress that will either catalyze the potential or extinguish it. The conclave caused the stress, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. 40 years of invisible observation. The arrival 18 months ago. The assessments. All of it deliberate. You're not architects, she said. You're gardeners. The amber eyes held steady. The subsonic vibration in her sternum did something she could only describe as a scent. On the 7th day, everything changed. The alarm. Not a human alarm, but a conclave one. A modulation of the station's structure itself. A harmonic that all 12 of them felt in their teeth and joints. Came in the middle of what had been, for the first time, something almost like a rest period. Mara had been sitting with Daniel and Ryuvan and the teenager, whose name, she had finally learned, was Yuki, was not just 17, but also, somehow, the most precise thinker in the room when the problem required elegance rather than force. Playing a four-handed card game that none of them knew the rules of and had been improvising together for 2 days. The harmonic hit and Osik appeared in the doorway at a speed Mara hadn't known it was capable of. A conclave vessel has been damaged, it said. We require your help. Our help, said Emmanuel flatly. The engineering team assigned to this station was aboard the damaged vessel. You are the available personnel. We're humans, said the Ukrainian, whose name was Halina, and who had the practical fatalism of someone who had spent years keeping military equipment functional with inadequate supplies. We don't know your systems. You have been learning them for 7 days. That's not very long. No. said Osek. It is not. The damaged vessel, a mid-sized conclave logistics craft that had sustained a catastrophic failure in its containment array during an approach maneuver, was attached to the station's emergency dock. The containment array regulated a form of energy storage that the conclave used for propulsion, and the failure had created a cascade that was, Osek explained as they moved through the station's corridors at a pace that made Ryuven Tress jaw set with the effort of keeping up. Analogous in effect to an uncontrolled nuclear reaction, except that the energy type involved would not produce radiation, but would produce a structural collapse of the local spacetime metric within approximately 300 meters. Define local spacetime collapse, said Mara. Everything within 300 meters would cease to exist in the sense that currently applies to it. That's a very polite way to say it. We are trying to be precise rather than alarming. It's alarming. Yes. The containment array had 22 access nodes distributed across the vessel's engineering deck. Each node required simultaneous intervention, not sequential, simultaneous, because the cascade was self-reinforcing. If any single node stabilized while others remained in failure, the energy redistribution would accelerate the collapse rather than arrest it. 2 nodes, 12 humans. 10 of us take 2 nodes each. 2 of us take 1, said Helena immediately. She was already pulling up the schematic on a conclave, rotating it with the casual confidence of someone who had spent decades learning the layouts of machines she'd never seen before. What are we doing at each node? Osek showed them. It was not complicated exactly. It was the kind of procedure that would have been simple, with the right training and familiar equipment. It was deeply, fundamentally not simple, with 7 days of partial knowledge and instruments designed for beings, with 2 additional limbs and senses that extended into frequencies humans couldn't access. They had 4 minutes. Okay, said Mara. She looked at the 12 of them. She looked at Ryuven, who was 83 years old, and had 8 months to live, and was gripping his olive wood cane with both hands and looking at the schematic with the same expression she imagined he'd worn for 50 years in the Negev. Solving problems with what was available rather than what was ideal. She looked at Yuki, who had already begun mentally decomposing the intervention procedure into its components with a focus that made her, 17 years old, seem like a fact about someone else entirely. She looked at Daniel, who was watching the group, the way he must have watched a restaurant during a difficult service, calm, tracking, ready to step into any gap. Everyone knows their nodes. 11 voices said yes. We go on 3, Helena said. Wait, said Mara. Everyone waited. The nodes on the port side of the engineering deck, nodes 14 through 19, the access is behind the secondary conduit housing. You have to reach past the housing to get to the manual interface. It's not intuitive. It's going to feel wrong, like you're going the wrong direction. She had noticed this when they were reviewing the schematic. She had said nothing before because there had been no reason to, and now there was. Go the wrong direction on purpose. Trust the wrongness. She looked at Helena, whose nodes were 17 and 18. Helena nodded once. 3, said Helena. Node 6 was at the far end of the engineering deck, past a tangle of conduit that she had to move through sideways with her arms above her head, and the access panel was sealed with a conclave fastener that her fingers couldn't quite operate because the grip geometry was wrong for human hands. She used the handle of a conclave tool like a lever. She'd improvised levers before. The panel came open. Inside was a manual interface that looked nothing like anything she had trained on, even in 7 days. It was a pressure-sensitive membrane overlaid with a pattern of nodes that she recognized from the schematic, but which, in person, in the dark, with 3 minutes remaining and a feeling in her sternum that she associated with impending failure, looked like a puzzle designed by something that didn't know what human hands were. She thought about polymers, about materials that revealed their properties only under stress. She put her palms flat on the membrane and felt it respond, not to her hands as a conclave operator's limbs would have responded, but to her body heat, her electrical field, the slight tremor that her fingers always had since a ladder fall in the lab 12 years ago. It responded wrong, and then right, and then wrong again, and she held still, and stopped trying to push it toward a particular outcome and instead let it find her. She thought about Ryuven saying, I think I was too attached to the version of the restaurant that existed in my head. The real one kept tensed different, and I wouldn't let it. That had been Daniel. But the thought was right. She stopped trying to make the interface be what she needed, and let it be what it was. Something in her, not in her hands, not in her brain, something lower. Something she could only locate by the fact that the feeling was physical and warm, and not at all frightening, which was strange under the circumstances. Something reached. The node stabilized. Across the engineering deck, in the next 90 seconds, 11 other nodes stabilized. The cascade arrested. The harmonic in the station's walls shifted from the high tight frequency of emergency, something lower and longer, something that resonated in her chest in a way she couldn't name, and she slid down the wall and sat on the floor of an alien vessel's engineering deck in the dark. And her hands were shaking, and she was laughing. Relief. Or not only from relief. Osik found her there. It sat beside her on the floor, an unusual posture she understood later, not one conclave attendants used easily, and it was quiet for a long time. What just happened? Mara asked. What you did at the interface. Osik said. That was not the procedure. I know. Procedure requires specific manual inputs in a specific sequence. You did not perform specific manual inputs in a specific sequence. I know, she said again. I don't actually know what I did. We do, said Osek. Or we have a partial understanding. A pause. The dormant potential we have been measuring, in moments of sufficient stress, combined with sufficient stillness. Those two things seem contradictory. They are not. In our experience, stress provides the pressure, stillness provides the direction, when both are present simultaneously. It vibrated something that the translator rendered as. The locked property opens. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth in her sternum that was not the emergency harmonic, but something else, something that hadn't been there before the last 7 days, or maybe had been there her whole life, and had simply been inaccessible. The other 11, she said. Did they? 12 of you stabilized your nodes. Not all of you access at the same quality of response, but yes, all 12. Osek's amber eyes held something she was beginning to read as wonder, though she wasn't sure that was the right word for it. 40 years of evaluation, we have never had 12 humans access this simultaneously. What does that mean? It means the threshold is closer than we thought. She leaned her head back against the wall. The engineering deck smelled like ozone and metal, and something she couldn't identify, something almost organic, and she thought about the cafeteria in Stuttgart with the cold lentil soup, and the screen suddenly carrying an alien, broadcast and the feeling of curiosity that had surprised her by still being there. Can I ask you something? Yes. What did you think humanity was going to need in order to cross the threshold? Before you found us, Osik considered. We thought you would need resolution of your major conflicts. Peace in the large political sense. We thought you would need significant technological advancement, particularly in energy systems. We thought you would need a period of extended stability, perhaps 2 or 3 generations without civilizational disruption. And instead you caused the opposite. And instead, Osik confirmed. We found that the potential does not activate instability. It activates in the space between difficulty and trust. It requires both the stress and the presence of other humans to direct it. Mara thought about Daniel passing her half a protein bar on a shuttle that smelled like recycled air. About Ryuven, explaining something in 4 languages simultaneously, leaning on an olive wood cane. About Yuki's face when the navigational problem had finally resolved. Not triumphant, just satisfied. The way a person looks when a thing that was wrong becomes right. We extend each other, she said. Yes, said Osik. That is what we could not have predicted. Most species develop tools to extend individual capacity. You extend each other. You always have. We did not understand that was itself the mechanism. They kept that for another 4 days. Not for evaluation, that was finished, though nobody used that word anymore. For something else, something that Osik described, with careful imprecision, as orientation. The 12 of them were given access to more of the station, to conclave records that had been translated, partially, into English, and cross-referenced into other human languages by the translation systems. They were given food that was not human food but was nutritionally compatible, which Mara found interesting, and Daniel found professionally offensive in a way that made everyone laugh. They were given time together and time alone. Mara spent 2 of those days writing letters. Not to anyone at the conclave, to her daughter, who was 20 and living in Amsterdam, and who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and who had stopped calling 2 years ago because they had been too absent for too long. To her former department head at Stuttgart, who had been trying to get her to come back for 3 years, and who she had been refusing out of a conviction that she had nothing left to offer that was worth offering. To a colleague who had published a materials paper last year that was quietly brilliant, and which Mara had read 4 times and never responded to because she hadn't been sure the thing she wanted to say. "This is important, you should keep going," was something she still had the right to say. She wrote all of them. She sent all of them. She didn't know if they would change anything. But she had spent 41 years seeing fracture points, and the things she knew about fracture points was that they were load-bearing. The crack itself held shape. The failure point was where the structure was most itself. On the last evening before they were to be returned to human space, she sat with the other 11 in the coral reef chamber, where they had first assembled, and they played the card game they still hadn't agreed on rules for, and Reuven cheated with the serenity of someone who had been cheating at cards his whole life and saw no reason to stop now, and Emmanuel caught him at it and laughed instead of objecting, and Helena was teaching Yuki a Ukrainian drinking song without any drinks because there were no drinks, and Daniel was watching all of them with the expression of someone who has run a restaurant for long enough to know that the service isn't about the food. Mara thought, this is the thing we carry, not the dormant potential, or not only that, though she could still feel it, warm and accessible in a way it had not been before, like a door that was no longer entirely closed. But this, the willingness to extend, the choice, in the face of something too large to face alone, to turn toward each other rather than away. The protein bar on the shuttle, the card game with improvised rules. The olive wood cane moving through an alien corridor at a pace that cost Reuven something, and he paid without complaint. She thought about the documentary she had seen years ago, one of those earnest, searching films about consciousness and human potential that she had watched on a slow afternoon and half-depisted, and then found herself thinking about for weeks afterward. A failing businessman and a wealthy wife looking for answers, looking for the force that made some people extraordinary and others empty. The film's conclusion, which she had received with the skepticism of an engineer, was that the force was already present in everyone, that it had always been present, that the only thing preventing it from being useful was that most people never reached the condition of simultaneous stress and surrender that allowed it to unlock. She had thought, watching it, that this was wishful thinking. She no longer thought that. The shuttleback smelled like recycled air and old coffee. She sat beside Daniel again, and he had another protein bar, and he split it without being asked. Outside the porthole, the conclave way station receded, the coral reef formation glowing with its cold blue, to the internal light. Massive and strange and permanent seeming in the way that things are when they have been there long before you arrived and will be there long after you leave. What do you think they're going to do? Daniel asked. The conclave, now that the evaluation is finished. I don't know, she said. Osik said the threshold is closer than they thought. I don't know what that means in practical terms. I have a theory, Reuven said from the seat behind them. She had not known he was awake. He had seemed to be sleeping, the olive wood cane laid across his knees. Tell us, she said. I think the evaluation was not about us, Reuven said, or not primarily about us. He shifted carefully. I think it was about them. I think the Conclave has been a stable civilization for a very long time. Long enough to forget what it felt like to be at the threshold. Long enough to lose the ability to imagine what's on the other side. He paused. Think like they brought us here to remember. Mara thought about Osek sitting on the floor of the engineering deck in a posture that was unusual for Conclave attendants. The amber eyes holding something she had read uncertainly as wonder. You think we reminded them, she said. I think when we stabilized those nodes in a way the procedure didn't account for, we showed them something they didn't have a category for. He adjusted his cane. Old civilizations stop expecting to be surprised. We surprised them. Daniel turned this over for a moment. That doesn't sound like a particularly human advantage, he said. Surprising people. Of course it is, said Ryuven. We surprise ourselves constantly. We make decisions we didn't predict, and fickle things we can't explain, and reach for things we can't see. Species, once they reach a certain stage of development, stop doing that. They optimize. He made a small gesture with one hand. We are very bad at optimizing. That's a generous interpretation of our failure modes, Mara said. I am 83 years old and I have 8 months to live, said Ryuven. I am entitled to generous interpretations. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the gas giant turned. The stars were the same stars they always were, indifferent and numberless. I'm going back to the restaurant, Daniel said eventually. A third time. I know that's probably idiotic. It's probably idiotic, Mara agreed. Do it anyway. You? She thought about the letters she had sent. About her daughter's eyes in her own face. About the materials paper that deserved a response. And the department that had been asking for her to come back, and the work that was still there, still waiting. The fractious lines and things she still knew how to read. I'm going back to Stuttgart, she said. She didn't say, and I'm going to call my daughter. She didn't say, and I'm going to actually show up this time. Her, not the version of show up that is physically present, but mentally absent. The kind she'd been practicing for a decade. She didn't say any of that. Because saying it would make it a declaration, and she was an engineer, and she didn't trust declarations. She trusted load-bearing structures, and the only load-bearing thing here was the doing of it. But she thought it. And she thought about the warm thing in her chest that was not relief and not pride, but something older than either, something that had been dormant in her, since she couldn't remember when, and had come awake in an alien engineering deck in the dark. Under conditions of simultaneous stress and surrender, in the presence of 11 other humans, who had each carried their own version of the same, locked potential toward the same open door, she thought. We have always had this. We have always been this. We just needed the right kind of pressure to find it. The shuttle docked at the transit hub 4 hours later, and they separated the way people do at the end of something significant. With less ceremony than the moment deserved, and more substance than any ceremony could have held. Handshakes, and a longer thing from Emmanuel, who hugged like it was a practice he believed in on principle. Yuki bowed to each of them, and Mara bowed back and found she meant it. Helena shook Mara's hand with the grip of someone who had spent years on equipment that required firm handling and said, in her careful English, "You were useful. That is a compliment." "I know," Mara said. "Thank you." Proven was last. He stood with his olive wood cane and looked at her with the ancient, accurate expression of someone who has run out of patience for anything that isn't true. "Go home," he said. "And when you get there, be there." She thought about asking him if he would be in touch. She thought about the 8 months. She looked at the cane, which was worn smooth at the handle, from decades of use, from 50 years of gripping it while solving problems in the Negev, with insufficient materials and insufficient time, and the absolute conviction that the solution existed somewhere in the available resources. "I'll try," she said. He patted her arm once with the precision of someone who understands the difference between a gesture and a promise, and turned and walked toward the departure corridor. And she watched him go, the cane moving with him, until he turned a corner and was gone. Mara Voss stood in the transit hub of a refueling station orbiting a nameless gas giant, and felt the stars pressing in from all sides, and the warm thing in her chest pressing back, and she thought, 41 years of being a material under stress. All that time the property was already there. She picked up her bag and walked toward the departure gates, and she did not look back, Because the thing worth looking at was ahead, and she could finally see it. It had been there all along, waiting, as the things most worth finding always are. Not to be discovered, to be reached. But